Well, welcome to another session of the Green Citizen at Seneca College, and it's a tremendous pleasure for me today to be talking with Brian Hamlin. Brian is kind of the Pied Piper of bees, if you get the Hamlin reference, and he goes by the title, many titles for people who work with bees and love bees and are guardians of bees, I guess is a nice way to put it. Beekeeper, bee guardian, apiarist. I think I got that out correctly without too many troubles. Brian, great to have you with us today.
Thank you, Bill. Nice to be here. This has been a really interesting project here at Seneca. And every time I come, there's usually people that are interested to learn more about beekeeping and honeybees and the connection of pollination to the environment.
Why do you think that is? What's driven this kind of I mean, there was a time when we just took bees for granted, perhaps. Why is that no longer the case?
I think there's been a lot of awareness because of media coverage regarding things like colony collapse, pesticides that are widespread, habitats being lost by pollinators. Yeah.
I sometimes think that bees may actually in some ways prosper more in an urban setting, such as we're in right now, than in a rural setting. Is there any kind of truth to that observation?
There's certain aspects of that are quite true, and especially in terms of the actual honey itself,
right?
Because the bees in an urban environment are gathering from quite a diverse environment, as opposed to in the country where it could be like a monocrop of hundreds and hundreds of acres of clover or alfalfa. So the bees are getting a wide range. So it actually creates interesting flavors in the honey as well, and very specific to areas. So one urban area would be quite different from another.
I want to kind of dispel some, I don't know if they're myths or worries that people have with any flying insect, and particularly I suppose one that can sting. Help us distinguish between bees, which are mainly interested in pollination and just tending to crops, and perhaps wasps, hornets, that sort of thing. How do we think about them, and how should we differentiate them, and how should we be concerned about them in terms of their interaction with the human colony, as it were?
Well, things like hornets and wasps would be probably called more predatory in their nature. They tend to be also called carnivores because they will feed and eat on anything, and they will look all over the place just to get free things, whereas honeybees are actually creating everything within their culture that they need. So they're not quite interested in what we're doing as humans. We may cast a shadow over a flower, but that's not going to irritate them enough to sting us. And when a honeybee stings, they actually lose their life, as opposed to a wasp, which can be a multiple offender of stings. So honeybees are really only going to give up their life if it's something quite important, like protecting the general colony.
Right. Yeah. Talk to us about the bee colony, and give us a little bit of a sense of the history of honeybees and, perhaps even kind of pre-human history and into human history. And, how do we think about that historic role of the bee? And what are some of the important attributes of what they contribute to us and to nature in general?
Good question. Big question.
Big question, yeah. Take it away.
Okay. Bees have been on the planet longer than humans have. So in some ways we've co-evolved together, and man has had a relationship specifically with honeybees for several millennia. Ancient cave dwellers, etc. There'd be something called honey robbing, where they would look for combs to take the honey that way. So earliest connections were actually honey robbing or honey hunting. And there are depictions, in caves and whatnot of that activity. And it was widespread in the world, very many different parts of the world. And eventually man started to observe honeybees and sort of recognize certain traits that they had. And honeybees specifically are very social insects, unlike most other insects.
Interesting.
An ant might be the only other insect that would be considered hypersocial. So by observing honeybees, they sort of would see that there's something interesting going on there with a very large group of bees clustered together. And in older times, bees would generally have been forest dwellers, and therefore hollowed out logs, that sort of thing would have been their primary nesting areas. But man observing that started to actually realize that they could actually move that log to an area that was easier for them to access, and then they could observe the bees even more and access the honey as well. So Egyptians, for example, they would have been floating hives out on the Nile, on rafts, pollinating crops up and down the Nile. In Mesopotamia, King Solomon's days as well, hives would have been in centers where people lived. So what we're doing when we're talking about urban beekeeping, it isn't a new phenomenon. It's not new age. It's actually an ancient tradition with man to have connected with honeybees where they lived. And there are other types of bees that peoples have kept as well. For example, honeybees are not native to America, but the ancient Maya and the ancient Inca kept stingless bees in small clay pots. And they didn't produce honey, but they produced something very similar to honey. It would be like a syrup, a more liquid syrup. So when Spaniards first came to the Americas, they noticed, they observed that right away, that, what were these little clay pots right at the houses of the Inca and the Mayan cultures. And they soon introduced honeybees to the Native Americans, and Native Americans very quickly adapted to honeybee culture. And within 50 years, it was the second largest export to Spain from the Maya was beeswax, actually. Beeswax was quite in demand because that's all that was burnt in cathedrals and temples and so on. In terms of bee culture, there are three types of honeybees. There's the queen, there's the worker bee, which is female, and the drones. And the hive is predominantly made up of the worker bees, and drones are produced when needed, and they're used sort of as a sperm bank. They don't really have other functions other than aiding in reproduction. So they're often discarded at the end of the season because they can be reproduced in the spring when they're needed. And the queen will go on one flight, called a maiden flight, where she copulates with up to maybe 15 drones, 5 to 15 depending. And then that's her only mating time is just once. And she has a large reservoir for holding the sperm for several years, and slowly.
Hence the term busy bee, I guess.
Busy bee. But the queen, often people have the conception possibly that the queen holds some special royal title within the hive. She does have a special function, but the hive, again, as I said, is predominantly a female culture within there. So the queen is just seen as a bee that lays eggs amongst the workers. So the worker bees have a variety of duties within the hive, and one of them would be to attend to the queen in terms of feeding her, cleaning her, removing her feces. She's the only bee that wouldn't tend to be flying out of the hive. Bees are extremely hygienic, so they don't defecate in the hive, so they'll do cleansing flights outside the hive. So in winter, for example, it's obvious you can see snow spotted. But some of the duties within the hive are when the bees first actually hatch from the egg and the larva, the pupa. They do inside work in the hive, and that's doing architecture, which is an amazing honeycomb pattern that is developed with a hexagonal cell, which can hold tremendous weights. It's very delicate, but can hold tremendous weights. And everything is done within the hive on the comb. So, for example, when bees are being reared, the egg is laid in the cell. When pollen's brought back, it's stored in the cell. When nectars from the flowers are brought back, it's also stored in the cell. So the new bees start learning about the culture within the hive to begin with. So duties like nursing, architects, cleaning, as well as guards. Each hive is individual by the queen's pheromone or scent. So there'd be actually guards at the front of these hives that can detect like a foreign pheromone or other predatory insects that are quite interested in what's inside and trying to get at that.
Brian, just to a point, we're on a roof here. Is there any reason that being on we're in a suburban setting, we're at Highway 404 and Finch Avenue. Is there any reason a roof environment or setting for bees is better perhaps in some other kind of locales? What are some of the attractive features of being up here?
The main advantage of a rooftop in an urban environment is, again, to protect the bees from people. And often it's thought the other way around. People need to be protected from the bees. But it also psychologically protects the people from the bees in that they realize the bees are removed. So there are a lot of fears around stinging insects. So there are disadvantages of rooftops as well. It's a lot more work flying up 3 flights or 8 flights in wind and whatnot, carrying extremely heavy loads compared to the weight of their own bodies. So that's one disadvantage to keeping them up here. An advantage again would be that there don't tend to be predators on the rooftop. You're not getting skunks and mice and raccoons, sometimes raccoons.
Now this is not the first one you've done in Toronto. You're kind of an apostle, you might say, for urban beekeeping. Tell us about some of the locations just in Toronto alone that bees are located, the beehives, and some of the work you do.
My first urban apiary was actually Toronto Island, and I started that about 10 years ago, and it's in a lovely location, and fantastic honey. Very green environment. There are people that live on Ward's Island. The hives are not close to where they live. But that was sort of the beginning of my urban connections with beekeeping. And from there, it became sort of a springboard. And I was invited to put hives down at the Portland's Energy Center, which is in the Leslie Spit area, the Portland's area. And it's also a very rich area in wild wetland flora. And the Toronto Island and the Portland's area are extremely close. There's only a tiny strip of water between the two, but the honeys are very different from each other in many ways, color as well as taste. And that has to do specifically with the difference in the environment. So that's become a very good educational tool for people. When they see and taste those honeys and think, wow, that's amazing that these bees are so close to each other, but there's such differences. So that's become a good tool for people to be aware of honey being very specific to an environment. From there, I started connecting with the University of Toronto and started hives at New College, which is College and Spadina, or specifically Wilcox and Spadina, right on the corner. I can see streetcars when I'm on the rooftop going by, and again, those bees are not exposed to the same type of flora as the bees down by the lake. They don't have the wild wetland flora. They don't have a lot of wild flowers. They have some, like clovers and smaller things. But their foraging area is quite different again. It's very urbane. So these bees would be going to Kensington Market, Queen's Park, Philosopher's Walk behind the museum.
Must be pretty smart bees after all that exposure.
PhBs for sure. But that honey also is quite different in color and in taste from the Portland's ones. And so from the U of T South, I went to U of T at Scarborough, and there's a huge green valley there, as well as a close community of people living around that area as well that have gardens and various things. And again, my idea was also, by doing urban beekeeping, was to connect with especially young people. Because often they haven't had the opportunities that I have from my generation. I grew up in the country and had a variety of experiences outside of urban environments. And often young folks raised in urban environments, they see videos or they see TV programs and whatnot. But by having hives for example, at the residence of New College, right where the students live, it created an interest. And so I was invited to speak at Hart House.
Wonderful.
And this is exactly what I wanted. So I opened up by saying, I'm actually here to recruit new beekeepers. And from that, the U of T Bees Club began. And they now have 3 rooftops where they keep bees as well. And they're very proactive in the educational component of pollination, beekeeping. urban living, sustainability,
Yep.
local, and they do regular visits to their hives, and they do a lot of good things. And because it's a university and because it's students, as we all know, students are there for 3 or 4 years,
Yep.
2 years, and they move on. So these students had a strong awareness that we want to keep this club going. So they would always zero in on first-year students.
Good for them.
And be mentoring,
Yep.
the keenest people they could,
Right.
because they knew it needed to carry on and take over. But some of the beginning members of the club, they actually still volunteer and are active in supporting the group as well.
So beginners are very important, obviously.
Beginners.
When we look out on the roof here, we see an expanse of green in the distance. We see Seneca's community garden. What are some of the kind of planting regimes that really would encourage and make for a healthier bee colony? What are some of the things that we should be planting that would support that?
Well, right off, I always recommend to people herbs, because honeybees and pollinators in general really get a wide variety of nectars and pollen, actually, from herbs. I'm talking about sage,
Right.
thyme, rosemary, lavender. I could go on and on with herbs. But the good thing about planting the herbs is it's great for pollinators, it's great for us, because then you can utilize those plants as well after in your cuisine.
Yes.
But a lot of native plants are quite important as well. I'm thinking of milkweed, and there's been a lot of talk about the disappearance of monarchs. And what I've observed in the last few years is city folk are planting lots of milkweed, and I've actually seen a few monarchs. And I hadn't seen any last year, but this year I've actually seen a few, and they were actually in the city, down at the Portlands. And
So it's that complementarity that's so important, not only from the bees and other forms of nature, but also for us as humans and how we interact with them. I know that our First Nations group at Seneca was very keen on this, and I know you've done some work with First Nations groups. And what are some of the things that have come out of that work that you've done?
Okay. Well, I would say I've actually learned from First Nations as opposed to working with them. I've learned to respect nature in a more astute way and in a different way. Because in general, native cultures recognize the earth and the planet as our mother, and all our sustenance comes from the earth. So something like pollination is vital for food, and so there's that connection as well. But when we started these hives at Seneca, Peggy Pitawanakwat actually came, and she did a traditional smudging ceremony. And smudging, it's a simple ceremony, and she used sage, which is one of the sacred medicines from the Anishinaabe or the Ojibwe tradition, which is her tradition. And so by using sage, it's a female medicine as well that's often burnt, and it's an offering that's sort of like an incense. In a European sense, it would be like an incense that's being burnt. But it's a way of respecting ancestors as well, because the smoke rises. And so with First Nations culture, ancestors are quite important, because they were the people that came before, and they're the people that are the teachers and the people that have knowledge. So there's always that respect. So when I knew Peggy was here, it was important for me to ask her to actually come up and sort of recognize what we were bringing to Seneca, which is also a contribution to the environment. So it's First Nations culture. The biggest thing I remember is usually respect about all things that are growing, all things that are living.
Wonderful.
And everything has a purpose. And honeybees, it's an obvious connection that's very visible to see what they're doing going out to the plants and flowers, and then when they're coming back. And you can see all that. It's very tangible sort of thing. And you can taste the honey. You can taste the pollen. You can smell the wax. So those connections are very vital.
Now, at the end of the day, we all have a sweet tooth, and I know we look forward to some of the honey that might come from this. So it's kind of, this is a win-win-win-win. We just seem to win all over the place. Just talk about, perhaps briefly, about the whole notion of pasteurization versus non-pasteurization of honey as well.
All right. First off, with honey, my approach is, and I try to do things as natural as I can, and honey's a really important byproduct that the bees make, but it's not the most important contribution they make. It's always pollination. So whenever I'm sort of sharing about honeybees and culture of honeybees, is I always have to recognize that it's the job of pollination that they're doing that's really the vital thing. When they produce surplus honey, that's fantastic. It's a fantastic gift. Now, honeybees have been domesticated over millennium to overproduce, something similar to cows. Cows overproduce milk, and therefore we utilize the overproduction, and we embrace it, and we love it. And it's fantastic. But in modern times, people have thought that things should be sterilized or pasteurized because they considered there was possible potential of diseases, say that milk would carry and whatnot. Now, honey's a little different. When honey's pasteurized, it actually destroys the enzymes in it and the minerals and nutrients. So in some cultures, like the ancient Hindu culture, they see pasteurized honey as a negative, as something that's unhealthy, something that you wouldn't put in your body. So pasteurization, again, it liquefies the honey, and it's somewhat of a commercial marketing, has been a commercial marketing tool because it always looks liquid and golden. So people over a long period of time have associated honey looking that way. So often they'll see my honey, which is very thick, solidified, cloudy, and they'll say, well, what's wrong with this? And I'll say, this is right.
This is the real honey.
This is right from the bees. This is how nature would have left honey. It wouldn't have been man processing it in some way. This is me just extracting the honey, leaving it as it is. And in this climate, cold climate in winter, honey will naturally solidify. And the plants that the bees are gathering from also encourage that type of honey to happen. If you're getting honey from a tropical country, different types of plants, different vegetation, different environment, that honey doesn't solidify. So you can bring that honey from Jamaica or Hawaii or whatever, and it will always stay liquid because of the source that the honey has come from.
Brian, you've made a believer of me, believer. Poor joke. And my colleagues at Seneca College, we're ecstatic about this initiative, and we hope that this continues for many more years. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you for inviting me to do the project here, too. It's been wonderful being able to share with other people, and I can see in the future this will carry on by other people other than me even that will actually proliferate the apiary, and
Thank you.
Thank you.